With the Edmonton Oilers set to hire a new general manager any day now, let's take a trip down memory lane and look at recent Oilers general managers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I'm your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everybody who makes Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, today's episode, very straightforward. Building off of yesterday's show where we talked about what a good general manager has, what traits they have, what makes them successful, we're going to look at the Oilers' history of general managers going back to the lockout, the big lockout, not 12-13. We're talking about the one that wiped out an entire season. Then they come back. There's a salary cap and a whole bunch of new mechanics within the CBA to kind of change the way things work. So we're going to start. And I've graded this on a rubric. I'm not doing this in chronological order. This is a genuine rankings. I broke it down into 5 categories. You could get up to 5 points in each category. The categories I have are team success, so like playoff series wins, draft success of how many players did you turn into NHL players, and how many of those NHL players were high-end or star caliber players, contracts as far as value and maximizing getting the maximum value on a contract for a player, whether it was in free agency or an extension for a player that was already under contract. I have consistency. Were you good for an extended period of time? Or was the team one good playoff appearance or 2 playoff appearances and then very quickly fell off, falling up and down in the standings, changing coaches consistently? And that's the last segment, coaching hires, because that is part of the story as to why the Oilers struggled for a lot of the 2010s and the late 2000s was their inability to get the right marriage of roster and coach. So starting out, the low man on the totem pole. We have 5 candidates. We're not doing interim, so Jeff Jackson and Keith Gretzky will not be spoken about on today's show. Though I will say Jeff Jackson's got a strong case that he already might be the second best Oilers general manager of the last 20 years based on his 3 weeks on the job. But the low man on the totem pole. We have to start with Steve Tambellini. Now, I can understand the issues of when he took the job, what didn't work out for him, and why it was such a difficult slate, why it was such a difficult hand to play. And the context does matter. You have to be able to address why some things happened. It's not just that they happened, it's that they happened for a specific reason. That when you're talking about how how an executive does their job, you have to understand what they're coming into. And Tambellini takes the job after Kevin Lowe. Kevin Lowe has that job for 8 years. He has it from 2000 to 2008. They have a Stanley Cup final appearance in there. They make the playoffs 3 times in 8 years in Kevin Lowe's tenure. But he's coming into a team that very clearly needs to rebuild. You look at where the Oilers are at in their trajectory as a team going into 2008, and I'm going to click over to my notes here. He goes Tom Renney as the coach, so you have an Oilers connection to Glenn Sather there. Tom Renney had previously been the coach of the New York Rangers and a coach in Edmonton at various points. Then they go to Pat Quinn, who hadn't coached in 5 years. He gets a 2-year trial run there. And then Ralph Krueger is the last coach that Tambellini hires. And Ralph Krueger was a first-time head coach, which in a vacuum makes sense for a rebuilding team. When you have a rebuilding team, you want somebody who has, an AHL or a developmental or a European League background because they're more adept at dealing with different types of players. And when you're a rebuilding team, you're trying to ascend, to climb out of the abyss. You need a coach who's going to be well-versed in handling a lot of players. Good things, Tambellini does have on his ledger. He drafted Taylor Hall, drafted Jordan Eberle, he drafted Eric Gustafsson, Tyler Pitlick, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Oscar Klefbom, Tobias Ryder, Juju Karhara, and Niall Yakupov. He gets Yakupov gets into the hit column. I know when you pick a guy first overall, games played is not really the barometer, but a guy who plays 300 games at the NHL level, that even if it is a first overall pick, that's a hit. Obviously, you want to draft your guy. If you draft someone first overall, you want a star. And we're going to talk about that in relation to some of the other general managers in their inability to turn draft pick players into stars. But the losers, a lot of trades didn't work out during the Tambellini administration. I read an article in doing the research for this that the Oilers basically got 50% of the games played in these trades, that they traded guys to other teams, and the guys they got in return played about half of the total NHL games that guys Tambellini traded away did. So that's a really rough barometer of gauging trade value, but it does give you an indication that they traded for guys who were close to the end of their careers. Ryan Whitney comes to mind there, and traded for guys who maybe weren't ever that good to begin with, and maybe they were taking a chance on, but weren't able to really populate and get through. And the last thing on this Tambellini point is, when you are assuming control of a team that is clearly going into a rebuilding period, you need as many cracks at it as you can, if that makes sense. And there are some good players in there. You know, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Oscar Klefbom, Jordan Eberle, Taylor Hall. That's a really good 4 players. And that's a really good 4 players. You know, Klefbom is one of the great what ifs for the Oilers in their recent history. What happens if he doesn't get hurt? What does the trajectory of his career look like? Somebody who very clearly seemed to have the goods as a first pair guy, but the injuries obviously forced a premature end to his career. Jordan Eberle got traded for Ryan Strome. That's not his fault. We're going to talk about the Peter Chiarelli trades in a little bit, but it's not his fault. You want to take a deep breath there. And then we'll get Craig McTavish in now. I have Craig McTavish ranked second. Oh, and for transparency, I have Tambellini graded with 8 points out of 25. I have him 1 point for success, team success, 3 points for drafting, 2 points for contract, 1 point for consistency, 1 point for coaching hires. Craig McTavish is next. He has a 1 in team success. The Oilers did not win a playoff series. He gets a 3 for drafting, which we're going to get to. He gets a 2 for contracts. He gets a 1 for consistency. And he gets a 2 for coaching hires as opposed to a 1. So when you look at McTavish's ledger, he fires Ralph Kruger. He hires Dallas Eakins, another first-time coach. He hires Todd McClellan, who, okay track record as a coach in San Jose, has gone on to a few other stops and been a solid NHL head coach, but nothing great. He's got Draisaitl, he's got Darnell Nurse, and he traded for David Perron. Draisaitl and Nurse slam dunk home runs. Like, I know Nurse now. We look at him and his contract very differently, and we will talk about Ken Holland's contract issues when we get to him. But Nurse is a slam dunk first round pick. He's got 500 plus NHL games played. He's been in the organization for 11 years. He's an above replacement level hockey player for an extended period of time, and he got the big contract. And how he's performing on that big contract is limiting the evaluation of him as a player. But as a draft pick, undoubtedly a hit. And then the bombs, bringing in Andrew Ferentz, bringing in Mark Fane, selling Jeff Petrie, and selling Devin Dubnyk. Imagine how different the Oilers look if Jeff Petrie gets an opportunity to play, or Devin Dubnyk gets an opportunity to play, as opposed to chasing the various guys they ended up doing, like Andre Sekera, who we're going to get to when we talk about Peter Chiarelli. And of course, Craig McTavish does have the stink of being in the boys club. You know, he was a really solid role player on a lot of teams that won Stanley Cups. He's part of that Glenn Sather DNA that kind of permeated between the Rangers and Oilers throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And there is a real, well, he only got this job because of his success as a player, as opposed to what he had done in his executive career to that point. So that'll do it for this first segment, you know, the abyss, if you will, in evaluation. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the middle of the middle of these rankings and a whole lot more. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need, prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on TV all day? You have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, moving along in our rankings of Oilers general managers, and these are good exercises. And I know I like to talk a lot about the philosophy and the formulation of episodes because I want to give you guys an idea of how I think about things, because it's important when you're making a case, you're making an argument, that everybody's kind of on level playing field. You know, that's one of the tenets of argument and conversation. You can't reason with an irrational person. You need to assume that both parties are operating and talking rationally for there to be a coherent conversation and a rational argument. Two people can disagree. I'm sure there are people who think McTavish might be higher than Kevin Lowe, or Chiarelli might be lower than Kevin Lowe, or Craig McTavish, or Chiarelli might be the worst person on this list. But I graded out a rubric. I explained the principles or the components within that rubric, and then I scored each general manager based on their performance in those categories. And that's one of the keys to doing a good list, to doing a good rankings. You need to have a rubric. It can't just be, well, I want this guy here, this guy here, this guy here. It's one of the issues with that ESPN top 100 athletes of the 21st century list. There's no rubric. There's no criteria. It's just, this is the list and this is the order we have them in. I like breaking things down into rubrics like this because then you get an understanding. So without further ado, we get to the third general manager on our list, and that's Kevin Lowe. He comes in with 12 points. He gets a 3 for team success. He gets a 2 for drafting. He gets 2 contracts, 3 for consistency, 2 for coaching hires. That's 12 total points. He's the general manager from 2000 to 2008. So one important component of understanding why Kevin Lowe's tenure is unique is that it's an 8-year window, and that's the longest of any Oilers general manager this century. So post 2000, he's the general manager pre-lockout and post-lockout. He's the general manager that has to oversee the transition from a capless league to a salary cap league. And the salary cap, when the NHL came out of that lockout in 2004-05, was not a lot of money. We're talking like $40-ish million. And Kevin Lowe got the second best performance of any single Oilers season since 2000. He got the Oilers to a Stanley Cup final. He swung the trade to get Chris Pronger. He swung the trade to bring in Michael Pekka. The knocks here on Kevin Lowe, not very consistent. 8 years, he's only in the playoffs 3 times. He loses in the first round 2 of those 3 times. The only playoff series he wins are all in that 05-06 season where they go to the Cup final and ultimately lose to Carolina. That team was good, but it does have the caveat of that 05-06 season, that first season out of the lockout, being weird, being abnormal. You know, that Hurricanes team very well might be the worst team of the lockout, the salary cap era, to win the Stanley Cup. Them or the Blues very well could be that team. So looking at Kevin Lowe, hits in the draft, Ales Hemsky, really solid NHL player for a long time. Never a star, though. Jarrett Stoll, really solid role player. Never a star. Matt Green, really solid role player. Went on to win some Stanley Cups with the Kings in 2012 and 2014. The trades for Chris Pronger, the trade for Michael Pekka, signing Dwayne Rollison, signing Sergei Samsonov, drafting Jeff Petrie, drafting Sam Gagner, drafting Andrew Cogliano. The knock on Lowe's drafting is that none of those guys are really none of those guys are stars. Hemsky is a good player. Sam Gagner has had a really solid NHL career. Jeff Petrie went on to have a really solid career in some other stops. Andrew Cogliano is a great role player. But when you are consistently missing the playoffs, as the Oilers did, missing the playoffs 5 out of the 8 seasons, you're expecting, if you're picking 14th or higher, you're getting some impactful players. And it's a real knock on Kevin Lowe that they don't have any stars from his era that were able to be passed on to, whether it be Tambellini or passed on to McTavish. It's really kind of tricky in that respect. And of course, the only coach he has during his tenure as general manager is Craig McTavish, who went from coach to general manager, even though he didn't really have a whole lot to show for his time as coach. And this is where, when we're talking about Lowe, we're talking about McTavish, the symbiotic relationship between the Oilers dynasty years in the 80s, Glenn Sather, and the Oilers through the 2000s. It's an essential component of having a conversation about the Oilers during that window. And you wonder, maybe if Kevin Lowe had a different coach than McTavish, or maybe Kevin Lowe looks at things a little bit differently. And I can't talk about Kevin Lowe without talking about one of the interesting things I found in my research here. And you'll have to forgive me, because when Kevin Lowe was Oilers general manager, I was, 11 years old. But he very much came out and said there are 2 types of Oilers fans: the ones who come to the arena and spend money, and then the ones who complain, which is really, it's not good business to call out your fans. You can never win as an executive, as a coach, as a player by saying, oh, some of us, the fans, are better than others, especially when we're talking about something like hockey, which is expensive, which is a luxury. And to say, well, there are 2 types of fans, the ones who care and those who don't, the ones who care spend money, is really just obnoxious and outright rude. And then, of course, to do I've got all these Stanley Cup rings from when I was a player. That's great. Rings are a measure of success. But Kevin Lowe, good player, not immortal, not essential to those Oilers teams and eventually the Rangers when they won the Stanley Cup in 94. But to come out so bold-faced and say, well, you don't know anything, I know everything because I won as a player, when being a good hockey player is not necessarily commiserate with the success you would have as a coach, general manager, an executive of any kind. And it's one of the real telltales of a good player. There is something about a good player that struggles to be able to connect with a less talented guy. And it's why we've seen really great players struggle to transition to coaching or to being a general manager. Initially, I had planned to talk about Peter Chiarelli in this segment as well, but being that we went long talking about the philosophy of the rubric and talking about some things outside of just the 5 evaluation categories of our rubric, talking about Kevin Lowe, we're going to take one more quick break. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about Peter Chiarelli. And of course, we're going to talk about Ken Holland. So be sure to stick around. It's summer. That means hot dogs, barbecues, beach, and of course, it means baseball. It means concerts. I am more likely than not going to a Mets-Braves game this weekend, probably on Friday, so I can see Kodai Senga's first start of the season. And the only place I buy tickets to go to games, go to concerts, is from our friends over at Gametime, with some of the best features in the ticket buying business. Things like zone deals, where you choose the section and let Gametime choose the seats. All-in pricing, where they show you the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. My personal favorite, the seat view, where you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. So you'll know if you're at Wrigley Field, if you're at Fenway Park, and you're sitting behind a pole. Things like the lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. And of course, Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying baseball or concert tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you to everybody who's hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. So let's get on into this, because I do have a tendency to yap. Next up, Peter Chiarelli, who I have graded as 11 out of 25. He's got a 2 for team success. They did make it to a second round of the playoffs. He gets a 4 for drafting. Most of that is because he took Connor McDavid, but he's got a few other good hits. He gets a 2 for contracts because some of the free agency decisions and contract extensions are horrendous. He gets a 1 for consistency for one singular playoff appearance, and he gets a 2 for coaching hires. So, coaching hires. He has Todd McClellan and he has Ken Hitchcock come in at the end of the season after he fires McClellan. He ultimately gets fired anyway. The hits in the draft: Connor McDavid, Evan Bouchard, John Marino, Ethan Bear, Vincent Desharnais, Stuart Skinner, Ryan McLeod. And he does get credit for giving Leon Draisaitl an 8-year contract coming off of a restricted free agent deal. We talked about it last week and the week before last. That's one of the real gambles you have to make as a general manager, is knowing when to buy on one of your restricted free agents, knowing when, hey, this guy has been good, but we very clearly think he's got another tier to get to. That alone, it takes real conviction to understand and really nail that. Of course, I'm about to list all of the misses. And trading Jordan Eberle for Ryan Strome, trading Ryan Strome for Ryan Spooner, giving Andre Sekera an extension and then his knee explodes and then he tears his Achilles, giving Mikko Koiskinen an extension 2 days before he got fired, giving Milan Lucic that enormous contract in free agency, trading a draft pick and a second-round pick for Griffin Reinhart, trading Taylor Hall for Adam Larson. I think it's fair to say Peter Chiarelli is a reasonably good drafter. He's a reasonably good identifier of amateur talent. Of course, you listening to this podcast could have took Connor McDavid first overall in 2015. He gets credit for taking him. That's it. The other picks, though, Bouchard, Marino, Bear, Desharnais, Skinner, McLeod, those are good. Those are good picks. All of those are good picks. And then taking the gamble on Draisaitl is important. The issue is Chiarelli's misses are so bad, it occluded the Oilers' possibility of being good. It is one thing to do well at one aspect of your job, which objectively, Chiarelli did a solid job drafting guys. He didn't get the coach right. He did not trade for the right guys. He did not prioritize skill sets to improve his team. And instead, he really lost a lot of these transactions, making those trades. Hall for Larson is egregious. Taylor Hall went on to win the Hart Trophy. Whether or not Taylor Hall hits that, 80, 90 point ceiling with the Oilers, I think there's a reasonable case to be made that if Taylor Hall just stays in Edmonton, he can be the Zach Hyman facsimile. He can be a 40-goal guy riding shotgun with McDavid. Now, Hyman's game is a little better tailored for the postseason, the grittiness, the forechecking. That type of stuff is very valuable. And Taylor Hall, as talented as he is, he's not a forechecker. He's not a grinder. He's not going to make stuff happen for you off of the cycle in the way Zach Hyman is. The other thing when we talk about Peter Chiarelli is the gaffes are egregious. Some of these trades are inexcusable. Trading 2 draft picks for Griffin Reinhart, who was nothing, absolutely nothing at the NHL level, inexcusable. Trading Jordan Eberle for Ryan Strome, inexcusable. Ryan Strome is a really solid hockey player. Jordan Eberle is more valuable. He's a goal scorer. Goals are more valuable than assists. Ryan Strome has had a solid NHL career. We had 3 nice seasons with the Rangers, riding shotgun with Artemi Panarin. He's doing okay in Anaheim, but he's cashed out. And then trading Ryan Strome for Ryan Spooner, who was out of the league within 2 seasons, just egregious. Absolutely egregious trade losing. And then the goaltending situation, just horrendous. Mikko Koiskinen buying a really short stretch as, this is real, and just never really being able to capitalize on McDavid and Draisaitl. And then, by default, this brings us to Ken Holland. Ken Holland gets a 4 in team success. He won more playoff series than every other general manager on this list combined. He gets a 2 for drafting because not a lot of his players have made it to the NHL yet. He gets a 2 for contracts because he has given some crappy ones out. He's given some real stinkers to guys like Jack Campbell and Darnell Nurse and Evander Kane. He gets a 3 for consistency because the Oilers have been in the playoffs pretty consistently during his tenure and made it past the first round a couple times now. And he gets a 3 for coaching hires because Jay Woodcroft and Chris Knobloch both seem to be reasonably gifted NHL head coaches. Ken Holland is first on this list by default. 2 general managers on this list did not make the playoffs one time. That immediately disqualifies them. One of these general managers didn't draft a single star. That disqualifies them. Peter Chiarelli's gaffes are so egregious, it held the Oilers back from being a real contender. Now, Ken Holland's misses are bad. The Nurse, Campbell, and Evander Kane contracts, that's 9.25, 5, and 5. That's like $19-20 million against the cap for 3 players who are ranging from okay in Evander Kane to outright egregious in Jack Campbell. And because of that, the Oilers had to make concessions in other places in their lineup. And now it's going to be on whoever Jeff Jackson hires to be the general manager to find a way to maximize the space that's left in spite of those contracts. And I think the Oilers are reasonably well positioned to be competitive going forward. But as we've discussed, once you lock up McDavid and Draisaitl, you got to find a way to make Bouchard work. And then you got to start figuring, okay, these are our foundational guys. How do we go around that? And Ken Holland did an okay job of transitioning the Oilers from first round exit playoff team to serious Stanley Cup contender. His misses, though, Cassian, Jack Campbell, Evander Kane, giving Darnell Nurse that big contract coming off of a very fugazi 2021 season that was only 56 games. He gets credit for some things I haven't mentioned. Zach Hyman is a free agent, home run, second best free agent signing in the salary cap era behind Artemi Panarin. And he gets credit for the Matthias Ekholm trade, which was imperative to ironing out some of the kinks with this Oilers team, was finding that first pair lefty. The misses, though, Campbell, Cassian, Nurse, Kane, and trading for Duncan Keith with no salary retention. Duncan Keith was a straight-up salary dump from the Blackhawks, and the Oilers gave up assets, which just seems illogical in hindsight. But for his warts, Ken Holland had the most team success, and he acquired really good players. Yes, he acquired some duds, but the team success was able to outpace the mistakes in a way that Peter Chiarelli's Oilers weren't able to. But that will just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. So, if you could be so kind, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live. Leave me a comment. Rank the 5 Oilers GMs we've talked about on today's show. And Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV Channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV Channels app. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.